Freddie Mercury was ignored at the Grammy Awards until he performed a song nobody expected. February 28, 1984, Shrine Auditorium, Los Angeles. The Grammy Awards were in full swing, celebrating the best of music's elite. Classical pianists in tuxedos mingled with jazz legends in tailored suits, everyone discussing serious music and artistic integrity. In a corner of the elegant reception hall, Freddie Mercury sat alone at a table, watching the industry he'd conquered treat him like he didn't belong. He hadn't been given a performance slot. Queen hadn't been nominated in any major category. And when he tried to join a conversation with some jazz veterans earlier, they'd politely excuse themselves with knowing smiles that said everything. "You're just a rock showman. This isn't your world." But across the room sat a baby grand piano in the lounge area, and Freddie Mercury was about to remind everyone that real talent doesn't care about genres. The 1984 Grammy Awards represented everything that was wrong with how the music industry viewed rock and roll. Despite Queen having sold millions of records worldwide, despite Bohemian Rhapsody having revolutionized what a rock song could be, despite stadiums full of screaming fans proving their cultural impact, the Grammy establishment still treated rock musicians as lesser artists compared to their jazz and classical counterparts. The ceremony that year was dominated by Michael Jackson's Thriller, which was sweeping every pop category, and by classical crossover artists who the Academy deemed respectable. Rock music was relegated to technical categories, presented during commercial breaks, treated as entertainment rather than art. Freddie Mercury had been invited to the ceremony as a courtesy, a token gesture to one of rock's biggest names. But the message was clear. Attend, smile for photos, but don't expect to be taken seriously by the real musicians in the room. When Freddie arrived at the Shrine Auditorium that evening, he was dressed impeccably in a custom-tailored tuxedo, his signature mustache perfectly groomed, his dark hair styled with his usual theatrical flair. He looked every bit the star he was. But as he moved through the reception area before the ceremony, he could feel the subtle dismissal in how people interacted with him. Classical musicians would nod politely, but quickly turn back to their own conversations. Jazz legends would shake his hand with forced smiles before finding reasons to move along. The message was unmistakable. You make music for teenagers. We make music for connoisseurs. At one point during the pre-ceremony reception, Freddie found himself standing near a group of jazz veterans discussing the death of musical sophistication in popular music. One of them, a trumpet player whose name Freddie recognized from legendary albums, was holding court. "It's all synthesizers and spectacle now," the man said, loud enough that Freddie couldn't help but overhear. "No real musicianship, no understanding of harmony or composition, just volume and costumes designed to distract from the fact that these rock performers can't actually sing without a studio full of effects." Freddie felt his jaw tighten. He'd spent his entire career studying music theory, perfecting his 4-octave range, crafting songs with operatic complexity that most serious musicians wouldn't dare attempt. But in this room, none of that mattered. He was just another rock star, all flash, no substance. The ceremony itself was no better. Rock categories were rushed through during the pre-telecast show. When awards for jazz and classical categories were presented during the main broadcast, they received extended standing ovations and respectful speeches about artistic excellence and musical integrity. Freddie sat through it all, maintaining his composure, but inside he was seething. Not with anger, but with something more powerful. The burning need to prove that he belonged in this room with these legends, that rock and roll could contain just as much artistry and vocal skill as any jazz standard or classical area. After the main ceremony ended, the crowd moved to the reception hall for the official Grammy Gala. This was where the real networking happened, where deals were made and legends traded stories. The room was elegant, filled with round tables covered in white linens, champagne flowing freely, and in one corner, a baby grand piano sat mostly ignored. Freddie found a table in a relatively quiet area and sat down with a glass of champagne, watching the industry elite mingle and congratulate each other. Nobody approached him. Nobody seemed to notice he was there. He was furniture in a room full of people who mattered. That's when he noticed the piano. It sat in the lounge area, probably placed there for ambient background music that nobody would actually listen to. Throughout the evening, a hired pianist had been playing quiet jazz standards, barely audible over the conversation. But now, during a break, the piano sat empty. Freddie stared at it for a long moment, an idea forming. He could just sit here for the rest of the evening, ignored and dismissed. Or he could remind these people what a real voice sounded like when it wasn't hiding behind genre prejudice. He stood up, straightened his tuxedo, and walked toward the piano with purpose. The lounge area was relatively empty. Most people clustered around the main reception space, networking and celebrating. The few people near the piano barely glanced at him as he sat down on the bench. To them, he was probably just another guest amusing himself during a lull in the festivities. Freddie placed his hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight beneath his fingers. He'd grown up playing piano, had studied classical technique before rock and roll had ever entered his life. The instrument was as natural to him as his own voice. He began to play My Funny Valentine, a jazz standard that had been recorded by every legend from Chet Baker to Frank Sinatra to Ella Fitzgerald. But Freddie didn't play it like any of them. He played it stripped down, vulnerable, with just enough complexity in his chord progressions to show anyone listening that he understood exactly what he was doing. And then he began to sing. His voice, freed from electric guitars and stadium acoustics, filled the lounge with a purity that stopped conversations mid-sentence. This wasn't Freddie Mercury, the rock god. This was Farouk Bulsara, the trained vocalist, demonstrating control and technique that most of the jazz singers in the room would struggle to match. He held notes impossibly long with perfect breath control. He bent phrases with the emotional intelligence of someone who truly understood the lyrics. His four-octave range allowed him to move from intimate lows to soaring highs without any strain or artifice. One by one, people began to notice. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Someone near the main reception area gestured for others to be quiet. The background noise of the gala began to fade as more people realized what was happening in the lounge. Freddie kept playing, his eyes closed, pouring every ounce of his considerable talent into a song that had nothing to do with Queen or rock and roll or anything else these people had dismissed him for. He was simply singing, showing them what his voice could do when stripped of all the spectacle they'd used to diminish his artistry. By the time he reached the bridge, the lounge area had fallen completely silent. People had moved closer, drinks forgotten in their hands, watching this rock star, this showman, they dismissed deliver one of the most technically perfect and emotionally devastating vocal performances many of them had ever heard. Among those who had moved closer was Ella Fitzgerald herself, the First Lady of Song, a legend whose vocal technique was studied by singers across every genre. She stood near the piano, her face showing recognition of what she was hearing. Not a rock star trying to sing jazz, but a genuinely gifted vocalist demonstrating mastery. When Freddie sang the final note, letting it fade naturally into silence, nobody moved for several seconds. The room had become a concert hall, every person present aware they'd just witnessed something special. Then Ella Fitzgerald began to applaud, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. Within seconds, the entire lounge joined her, and then people from the main reception area who had heard the music began applauding as well. Freddie opened his eyes, genuinely surprised by the response. He'd expected maybe polite acknowledgement, but this was something else entirely. These were professional musicians, people who understood technique and skill, showing respect for what he'd just demonstrated. Ella Fitzgerald walked to the piano, her elegant presence commanding attention even in a room full of stars. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying that famous warmth, "that was exquisite. Where did you study?" "St. Peter's School in India," Freddie replied, standing respectfully. "And every record I could get my hands on afterward, including many of yours, Miss Fitzgerald." She smiled. "You've been listening well. That breath control, those dynamics, that understanding of phrasing, that's not something you learn from rock and roll." "No, ma'am," Freddie said. "It's something you learn from real singing, the kind you've been teaching the world for decades." Tony Bennett, who had also moved closer during the performance, spoke up. "The kid's got a point, Ellos. Genre doesn't matter when you have that kind of voice." Ella nodded, looking at Freddie with new respect. "You're right, Tony. Talent is talent, regardless of whether it's performing in a jazz club or a rock stadium." She extended her hand to Freddie. "I apologize if any of us made you feel like you didn't belong here tonight. That performance proved you belong anywhere you choose to be." Freddie shook her hand, feeling years of dismissal and genre prejudice cracking under the weight of recognition from one of the greatest vocalists who ever lived. "Thank you, Bear," he said simply. "That means more than you know." Other musicians had gathered around now, introducing themselves, asking questions about his training and technique. The same people who had politely ignored him earlier were now treating him as a colleague, someone whose artistry deserved respect. One jazz pianist asked about his approach to improvisation. A classical singer wanted to know how he maintained his range across such demanding live performances. A composer inquired about his process for creating the complex harmonies in Queen songs. For the next hour, Freddie found himself in the kind of conversation he'd always wanted at these industry events. Serious musicians discussing craft and technique, sharing insights about vocal control and musical theory, treating each other as artists rather than competitors across genre lines. What made the moment even more significant was how it began to shift the room's entire energy. Other musicians who had witnessed Freddie's performance started questioning their own prejudices about rock music. A renowned classical cellist approached Freddie and admitted she'd never actually listened to Queen's albums, only dismissed them based on assumptions about the genre. "I think I owe it to myself as a musician to actually hear what you've been creating," she said. "If your voice can do that with a jazz standard, I'm curious what you're doing with your own compositions." Freddie smiled. "We're not so different, really. Queen approaches rock the way you approach classical, with respect for the craft, attention to detail, and the belief that popular music can be sophisticated without being pretentious." A jazz drummer who had been part of the dismissive conversation earlier made his way through the crowd, looking genuinely chagrined. "I owe you an apology," he said directly. "I said some things earlier about rock performers that were unfair and uninformed. That performance was as good as anything I've heard at the Village Vanguard." Freddie accepted the apology graciously. "No hard feelings. We've all got our blind spots. I've probably dismissed jazz as old people's music at some point in my youth, before I really listened and understood what you all were doing." The conversation continued, but what was most remarkable was how it spread beyond just Freddie. Musicians from different genres who normally stayed within their own circles began talking to each other, discovering common ground they hadn't known existed. The arbitrary walls between jazz, classical, and rock began to feel less solid, more like suggestions than rules. When the gala finally wound down and people began to leave, several musicians made a point of telling Freddie they'd be listening to Queen's albums with new appreciation, understanding now that what they dismissed as just rock music contained more technical sophistication than they'd given it credit for. As Freddie left the Shrine Auditorium that night, he reflected on what had happened. He hadn't won a Grammy. Queen still hadn't been recognized by the Academy in any meaningful way, but he'd achieved something more valuable. He'd forced the music establishment to see him not as a genre, but as a vocalist. He had proven that the four-octave range, the operatic complexity, the careful harmonies, and musical sophistication that Queen brought to rock music weren't tricks or gimmicks to cover up a lack of talent. They were the natural expression of musicians who understood their craft at the highest level. The story of Freddie Mercury's impromptu performance at the 1984 Grammy Gala spread through the music industry quickly. Jazz musicians who'd been dismissive of rock started actually listening to Queen's albums and discovering the musical complexity they'd overlooked. Classical vocalists began studying Freddie's techniques for maintaining range and power across demanding performances. Years later, when Queen was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001, several of the presenters mentioned that night at the Grammys as a turning point in how the industry viewed rock musicians not as separate from serious music, but as another valid expression of musical artistry. Ella Fitzgerald, before her death, was asked in an interview about memorable performances she'd witnessed. She mentioned Freddie Mercury's My Funny Valentine at the Grammy Gala, calling it one of the purest displays of vocal talent I ever heard, regardless of genre. Tony Bennett, who went on to collaborate with numerous rock artists later in his career, credited that night with opening his eyes to the fact that great singing transcended the artificial boundaries the industry created between musical styles. Freddie Mercury never forgot that evening, not because he'd proven anything to himself, he'd always known what he was capable of, but because he'd proven to the music establishment that genre was just a label and talent was talent, whether it was performing Bohemian Rhapsody at Wembley or My Funny Valentine at a Grammy gala. The baby grand piano at the Shrine Auditorium became part of Grammy legend. In subsequent years, it was moved to a more prominent location, and performers were encouraged to use it for impromptu performances throughout the evening. The Grammy organizers even started a tradition of setting aside time during the gala for surprise performances, hoping to capture more moments like the one Freddie created. But nothing quite matched that February night in 1984, when a rock star who'd been dismissed and ignored sat down at a forgotten piano in a corner lounge and reminded an entire room full of musical legends that true artistry doesn't care about genres, prejudices, or industry politics. It only cares about the truth that comes through when a real voice meets real emotion, and everything else falls away. In the decades since, music historians and critics have pointed to that Grammy Gala as a symbolic moment in the evolution of how the industry views cross-genre artistry. The rigid boundaries that once separated rock, jazz, classical, and pop began to soften, leading to more collaboration and mutual respect among musicians from different backgrounds. Freddie Mercury's impromptu performance didn't just change how people saw him, it helped change how the music world saw itself. Recognizing that talent, craft, and artistic integrity existed across all genres, and that the greatest musicians were those who understood that music was music, regardless of the label someone tried to put on it.